So please help me welcome Dr. Joseph Kezele.
Well, good evening, folks. It's good to be back in Minnesota. Everyone here has been so hospitable. We're having a great time. My wife Patty and I are just, having a thrill being with you. It's a great time to be a Bible-believing Christian. We have more actual, factual evidence than ever before, which confirms Scripture. And so it's a marvelous place to be. So tonight's topic, From Darwin to Dictatorship, is going to show how the inevitability of a society that bases its thinking in evolution will end up in a dictatorship. Because after all, if there is no one to be accountable to, each person thinks that he or she is the boss, and whoever has the biggest gun calls the shots. Okay, that's the theme of the talk. You can go home now. All right, so let's flesh this out. So we're going to talk about laying the foundation in Germany and the consequences, the revolution of foundation in Russia and the consequences, and the evolution of foundation in America, the consequences, the solution. So this is the cover of the first edition of Origin of Species. And so here's the title page, and then I blew it up so you could read it. So it's on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. That's not exactly a politically correct statement today, but that is the full title, and interesting that we don't hear the evolutionists talking about that full title. Well, that was published in English in 1859, and in 1860, it was translated into German, and Ernst Haeckel, 3 years before, had earned his MD degree and was in practice. But when he read the German edition in 1860, he was so taken by it that he decided to devote his career to promoting evolution. So he went back to school, and he worked on a PhD on the invertebrates in the ocean, the marine invertebrates. Those are the spineless critters in the ocean as opposed to the spineless critters in Washington, D.C. So he had his degree, his medical degree, and then he earned the PhD. And he earned it by doing good science. And then subsequently he became a professor at the University of Jena, where he had obtained his PhD. So he studied these marine invertebrates, and he also was a very gifted artist, and he illustrated the species that he had newly discovered and identified. So he was marvelously gifted this way. But he also was gifted with the ability to not only imagine or draw real organisms, but also to imagine the transition from non-living material to that first cell, which supposedly evolved through chemical evolution. And he named it Protomyxa odontiaca, which pretty much means golden snot. All right? So he published this along with other things to promote evolution. So if you don't have what you need, then you invent it. So what he did was he actually stole drawings from some of his colleagues at the university and altered them to make this progression, supposedly showing the progression from fish to human in the embryological stages of development. Well, even at that time, professors were saying, no, this isn't true, but he prevailed. Why? People wanted something to have to show that they could believe in evolution. We believe what we want to. So he was taken to the university court by other professors and was convicted of fraud in 1875. However, he weaseled out of it by saying, well, actually, it was the draftsman who did the altering of things and putting that together. But he didn't bother to tell him that he was the draftsman. Oh. Do these tactics sound familiar with what's going on today? So his fraudulent drawings are here compared with photographs of the actual embryos done quite some time ago. And you can see there's no correlation with his drawings on top and with the photographs of the embryos for those species at the bottom. So this is a falsehood which actually was kept in textbooks for a very long time until there was just no longer way to sustain that. So another one of his imaginary things was this business of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In English, what that means is the development of the individual in its stages before it becomes fully formed retraces the course of the history of the evolution of the species. All of that in those 3 words. And as part of that, he would call the structures gill slits, a yolk sac, and a tail. But this was all in evolutionary thinking and assumption. You know, I think a simple way to sum up evolutionary process is you assume what you need and you use circular reasoning to get there. I think that's a succinct way of incorporating it all right there. So with the gill slits, they're actually never functioned as gills, never had anything to do with gills whatsoever. And their proper name is pharyngeal pouches. And from those pharyngeal pouches, several different structures form. So from the first pharyngeal pouch, it becomes the middle ear, developing into tonsils, and then the middle ear, and then also the thymus and the parathyroid glands with the rest of these structures. The second one is the tonsils. The third one, the thymus gland, which we'll get back to in a bit. And then the parathyroid glands also, which are dealing with the calcium metabolism, control of calcium in your blood. And then in the fourth pharyngeal pouch is the other pair of parathyroid glands. And it's interesting that the third pharyngeal pouch gives the lower pair of parathyroid glands, but the fourth pouch gives the upper pair of parathyroid glands. And these produce a hormone called parathyroid hormone, which deals with calcium metabolism. So those were not pharyngeal pouches. I'm sorry, not gill slits, but pharyngeal pouches. Then we have the so-called yolk sac. It never had anything to do with yolk, never contained any yolk, and if you think so, then the yolk is on you. All right? Instead, its proper name is the umbilical vesicle, and that is the structure in which blood is first produced. Now think about this. In the very early stages of development, there are no bones. In all of us, the blood is made in our bone marrow. But in those very early stages, it's made in the umbilical vesicle, not the yolk sac. And then the switch is made for production to go to the liver and then the spleen, and then finally, when the bones are well developed, into the bone marrow. Now, I would like someone to explain to me how that happened by random chance events and how the organisms could survive during development with the need for the location of blood to be made to be switched from place to place to place. You see, it's just amazing what is ignored. All right, the 2 down, and then the next one is the so-called tail. Well, the structures of the spinal column and the spinal cord grow more quickly than the surrounding structures, so they do protrude. And so that's how it gives the false appearance of a tail. But then as development goes on, the other tissues catch up and there is no tail. Its proper name is the coccyx. So, but this has so permeated the popular culture, we say that I fell and broke my tailbone. So there never was a tail. All right. So this leads to the next concept that he was promulgating, and that is this business of vestigial organs. A vestige means a leftover, like a footprint. And these were supposedly degenerate or imperfectly developed organs that were left over through the various stages as we supposedly evolved. and sometime in the past did have a useful function, but not at this time. And 100 years ago, there was a list of about 100 or so structures that were supposedly these vestigial organs, these leftovers. But even if that had been the case, which it wasn't, that has nothing to do with explaining how those things came into existence in the first place. So let's take a look at a couple of the ones that are more prominently displayed. So the appendix, that's the number one item in this list. Well, it has a very rich blood supply. It's a very important part of the immune system. Now, if it was just a leftover, why should it have a rich blood supply? As an immune system component, it helps deals with harmful organisms that get into the gut. You know, we eat something, there's food poisoning or something, and so it deals with those organisms. But even beyond that, it deals with the stimulation of the production of antibodies to fight infection in the gut. IgA class of antibodies, immunoglobulin A class of antibodies, which are in body fluids. It also stimulates the production of IgG and IgM antibodies in the blood, so that if the infection escapes the GI tract and gets into the blood, then those antibodies are there to combat as well. Now, a very interesting thing beyond this is it's a reservoir for beneficial bacteria. So that if there is a severe case of diarrhea and the gut gets washed out, that appendix acts like a bank, and the beneficial bacteria we need that do lots of good things for us can be replenished by what's in that reservoir in the appendix. Another thing which is just amazing is during fetal development, it secretes hormones that guide development of the digestive and immune systems. Think about this. The appendix itself secretes hormones during the embryological stages, guiding the development of the digestive and immune systems. You never hear this spoken of. All right. Okay, another item is this very small muscle called the plantaris muscle. And there's the arrow, that little tiny little thing. It has less than 3% of the muscle mass that's in the lower leg. So it was assumed to be a leftover because it doesn't have any strength to do anything. Whereas you see the major muscles in the calf are the gastrocnemius and the soleus. But the thing about the plantaris is it's exceedingly rich in these muscle spindles, which are sensory organs. They sense the velocity and direction of motion within the muscles. So that's how athletes know where they're at and where they're going and at what speed. So folks who are ice skaters or, you know, basketball players, football players going up to catch a high ball, all of this stuff, I mean, any sport like that, tennis, whatever, those are very important structures. They are not part of a muscle, the plantaris, which is just a leftover from evolution. However, there is one possible true vestigial organ in the universe. And according to the ladies, that would be the male brain. All right? Because you see here these various parts here, especially the commitment molecule and the listening particle. And then there's the atom of personal hygiene. All right. And you see a large portion is devoted to inability to ask for directions, right? All right. So here's Darwin's original sketch of this so-called tree of life. From that first cell that it came into being from inorganic material, from non-living molecules, somehow, which after 100 years of research, they still have no answer. And I don't know how many billions of dollars have been spent. But what's great is all of that shows it didn't happen. It's very nice. Now here is Haeckel's version of that. He expanded upon that, and it's written in German. And so you see on the left-hand side his expanded German version, on the right-hand side Darwin's original sketch. And at the bottom of Haeckel's version is Moneron, that's somehow that first cell that came into being, and then amoeba, and then going on up through, skipping a bunch to amphibian, to reptiles, and then to men, Menschen, the German word for men. Now, the understanding was that this was white men, okay? Evolution was very racist. And so you see there above the gorillas and orangutans and the other simians. So here's a quote about Ernst Haeckel's evolutionary tree. Now, if instituting comparisons in both directions, we place the lowest and most ape-like men, the Austral, meaning southern Negroes, Bushmen, that would be western Africa, and in the Andamans, that group of islands in the Bay of Bengal off the coast of India. On the one hand, together with the most highly developed animals, for instance, with apes, dogs, and the elephants. All right, so that's one grouping. So here he's putting these people and those animals on one side of the spectrum. And then, on the other hand, with the most highly developed men, Aristotle, Newton, Spinoza, Kant, Lamarck, or Goethe. So these are all intellectuals or poets or philosophers. So this is who he placed on the other end of the spectrum. So he said that you have the less evolved on the left-hand side and the most highly evolved on the right-hand side. So making those comparisons, continuing with his quote, we can then no longer consider the assertion that the mental life of the higher mammals has gradually developed up to that of man as in any way exaggerated. So you can see this is quite racist. So, not having any fossil evidence for evolution, he hired Gabriel Max, a well-known artist at the time, to draw this family portrait here totally from imagination. So I forgot to say before, with assumption and circular reasoning, it's imagination, assumption, and circular reasoning. And he named it Pithecanthropus alalis, which means ape man without speech. So this is supposedly a step in the evolution towards modern man. And he would make huge, monster-sized posters of this and use this as part of his propaganda campaign. And he wrote this book, The History of Creation, Volume 1. And these are modern editions. I couldn't find a picture of the original. So this is Volume 1 and Volume 2. And these books were such hot sellers, they were sold for 50 years. 50 years. It's amazing. Up until about 1925 or so. Okay, so that was laying down the foundation in Germany. Now the consequences. Well, another quote from Haeckel is, politics is applied biology. Remember this one, you're going to see it again. Politics is applied biology. Well, he was laying down the foundation. Now the consequences were that this racial hygiene basics was proposed by Alfred Ploetz, one of the disciples of Haeckel here, and Ploetz and Ernst Ruden founded the German Society for Racial Hygiene. Hygiene, cleaning, racial cleaning. In other words, we have to get rid of the bad genes. Advocating eugenics. The word eugenics, eu means good or true, genics, genes. So good or true genes. So cleaning out the bad genes. Well, that means someone has to decide which genes are good or which are bad, or really, which people had good genes and which people had bad genes. And of course, the ones who make the decisions have appointed themselves as the ones to make the decisions. We've seen a lot of that thinking around here today. Well, at that time, in the first decade of the 1900s, what we now know as Namibia was German Southwest Africa. And they had two sets of laws, one for whites and one for blacks. And two of the various ethnic groups in that territory were the Herero and the Nama. And they had the nerve to rise up because they were being so severely maltreated and to rebel against the German masters. So the consequence was either imprisonment, chaining in concentration camps, now this is the first decade of the 1900s, or pushing them out into the desert with no water. And you can see the results of the condition in being in these camps. All right. Well, as I said, this was the foundation that was laid, and the education system was taken over by people who had this way of thinking. So we get to Hitler. Hitler didn't have to invent anything. He just simply used what was laid down before he came on the scene. And so Christianity, according to Hitler, is an organized lie that must be smashed. The state must remain the absolute master. And so, as I said, indoctrinating youth, taking over the education system so that in high schools and at least, if not younger groups, and in universities, there were these groups formed, student groups formed to promote Hitler and his ideology. Well, here, did you see that quote earlier? Politics is applied biology. Well, Hitler took it to heart. And so this resulted in, first of all, surgical sterilization. Now, Hitler came into power in 1932, so he wasted no time. So folks who were considered inferior, such as people with seizure disorders, alcoholics, people with physical deformities, would be surgically sterilized so they could not reproduce. Then along came surgical abortions, and then euthanasia. Okay, euthanasia supposedly meaning good death. Well, this was just simply not have to deal with the expense of people who weren't able to be productive members of society. So here was a poster that was made at the time. So those are 60,000 Reichsmarks, their equivalent of the dollar, saying, this is your money, this is what is being spent to keep these people supported. So he's setting up this campaign for euthanasia. And so in the town of Hadamar, there was a killing center developed, and the smoke you see there is the result of the cremation of the people who were euthanized. All right? Then it went on to medical experimentation, and I put that in quotation marks. So such things as Jews were placed into pressure chambers to simulate high altitude tests. Well, the point of this was to see how high German pilots could go in altitude before adverse things happened. Or prolonged immersion in ice cold water, because, for example, the Baltic Sea or the North Sea were very cold waters, and so this was to see how long pilots could last in the water before they succumbed to the cold water. Or gypsies giving salt water only to drink, same reason, being in the ocean. Or shooting prisoners with poison bullets, so that maybe would increase the kill rate against the enemy in battle. Or experiments to develop new mass surgical sterilization techniques on men and women. So who participated in these experiments? Well, that would be the physicians. Well, there would be two reasons why. Was there an outcry? And the answer is no. And the question, why not? And the answer is either indoctrination, which happened to much of the population with this indoctrination throughout the schooling, or fear of reprisal. If someone spoke out, then they knew they would end up in the concentration camps. That's what happens with total control. So then this progressed to genocide in 1940. All right, so this is a scene from Dachau. I've been there personally, and it's ironic. There's a sign, big sign in several languages that says "never again," but that's not true. It is happening repeatedly in various places. So here's a quote. "The things I saw beggar description. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda." Okay, can anybody state who said this? Yes?
President Eisenhower.
Absolutely correct. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Well, here is a place in Lithuania. These bunkers were actually built by the Imperial Russian Army prior to World War I. And when the Germans took over this territory in World War II, they converted them into warehouses to house the prisoners until they could be executed and then subsequently buried. So this was the command center, so you can see it had been fenced off so that they would be protected if there was some kind of uprising. And here is, behind the wall, the mass grave. And so here, to make it more legible, it says, "Here the remains of 50,000 people, Russians, Jews, Lithuanians, and others killed by the Nazis, are buried." And then as you, looking at that, as you look off to your left-hand side, there's this giant sculpture memorial. And with close-ups, you can see agonized faces and bodies there that were in the camps. Concept of subhuman types. We already alluded to that in the business with German Southwest Africa. So here you see this very iconic sequence from the simian to modern upright man who's, chugging along there on 2 feet quite well. All right, so now let's go to Revolution of Foundation in Russia. Here's another quote. "Darwin put an end to the belief that the animal and vegetable species bear no relation to one another except by chance, and that they were created by God." Anybody want to guess on this one? Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. And here happens to be a photo of a sculpture given to Lenin by an American industrialist, Armand Hammer, of Occidental Petroleum, with a monkey holding a human skull sitting on a stack of books, including On the Origin of Species. "You know, they are fooling us. There is no God. I will lend you a book to read. It will show you that the world and all living things are quite different from what you imagine. And all this talk about God is sheer nonsense." And that would be, if you look at the bottom, it says, Iosif Vissarion Jugashvili, otherwise known as Stalin. All right? By the way, he wasn't a Russian. He was an Ossetian, which is actually in the part that's called Georgia. Some people think he was a Georgian. He was actually an Ossetian. So he was a minority of a minority there, running the whole show. Darwin, you must read it. What book is that? His friend inquired. Darwin, you must read it. Okay, the consequences of this revolution. Here is another fellow who did excellent science, Ilya Ivanov, veterinarian. And he was very skilled in dealing with horses. And he developed a means, now this is way back in the first decade of the 1900s, of being able to do artificial insemination, and was very good at it. So people from around the world will take their prize stud stallions and take them to his facility so that then they could be used for artificial insemination. So he did excellent science. And then he played around cross-breeding various members of the horse kind, the equine kind. So inadvertently, he actually confirmed the concept of biblical kind, the horse kind. There are 8 species in the horse kind. And then he turned his attention to the cow kind, the bovine kind, and the European bison, and this Swiss domestic milk cow. And this particular species of bison did very well in places where it was mainly just weeds and rough kind of foliage that grew in arid areas. And they crossed them and got a crossbreed which could survive in those conditions and still produce reasonable amounts of good milk. And so that was the crossbreed there. Well, he also did things with various kinds of rodents as well. So he believed in evolution, so he turned his attention to why not hybridize humans and apes, since they're the same kind. So he proposed this in 1910. The World Congress of Zoologists said, go for it. The Soviet government, by then in 1917, the revolution occurred and the Soviets took control, and they said, go for it. So they gave him some money, so he had funds to work with. The British government promised funds. The American Association for Advancement of Atheism trumpeted what he was doing. The Pasteur Institute in France gave him the use of their simian facility in French Guinea in Western Africa. And the Soviet Academy of Sciences backed him fully. So here's an article. Scientists are confident that hybrids can be produced. And in the event we are successful, the question of the evolution of man will be established to the satisfaction of the most dogmatic anti-evolutionists. Anybody want to make a guess as to what newspaper, English-speaking newspaper, this was published in? New York Times. Absolutely right. See, they're consistent. They get an A+ for consistency over a long period of time, 100 years or more. So here is French Guinea in Western Africa, and the facility, whoops, I went too fast. Their facility there, Kindia, with the blue oval around it, is where an attempt was made to put human sperm into 5 simians, of course, without success. So then Ivanov took 30 simians and transported them to Soviet Union. And there is Georgia, that southernmost part of the Soviet Union where it was, you can't say warm, but you can say less cold. And Sukhumi is the place where the research station was established. And he put out a public call for human female volunteers to be inseminated with sperm from simians. One lady from St. Petersburg volunteered. She said, my life is such a mess, I might as well donate my body to science. But before anything could actually be done, the sexually mature simians all died from the cold. So nothing actually happened, but the attempt was trying to be made. Well, another player here is Trofim Lysenko, who grew up from a peasant family on a farm and learned some degree of agricultural knowledge, but he was extremely clever in being able to watch what was going on around him and know what the Soviet leadership wanted. And so they were looking for something in biology that would fit perfectly with atheistic, communist thinking. And one of the things was, well, if you can manipulate nature, if you can manipulate biology, then you can manipulate societies. And this is what they were looking for. Well, one of the things he came up with was this concept of vernalization, which was taking wheat seed and exposing it to extreme cold so that it would germinate in areas that normally would not grow in. And like a true evolutionist, he fudged his data, and he was given a certain amount of authority over some research stations and sent them the protocol, what to do, and then asked for their data. Well, they knew better than to give anything other than what looked favorable. Again, with absolute control, you want to stay alive. See, the whole thing under communism is you lie to live. You have to lie to survive. That's the way it works. So he had this massive amount of data, and he was very happily looked upon by the leadership and was given tremendous amounts of responsibility and given high ranking in Soviet science. So this business was, as I mentioned, the transformation of nature, people, and society. Concentration of power in politicians unqualified to make critical evaluations in technology and science. And I would say, from our experience here in the last few years, also power in the hands of scientists who were political rather than scientific. Follow the science. So there was enforcement of official policy by force, okay? And it was a disaster for Soviet agriculture. They got set back decades, production went down, it was bad news. And Lysenko was so clever, he managed to stay in favor into the 60s, through all those decades. Well, again, indoctrination of youth, here it is. Young builders of communism, that's what it says there. Melodiya stроители коммунизма. So you see, this is very similar to the posters with Hitler. Okay, the youth are saluting posters there of Stalin and Lenin. Okay, they're being indoctrinated. Well, in the Soviet Union, there were 15 various republics. By the way, Soviet means advisory. So USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So it's the Union of Advisory Socialist Republics. Well, obviously that's a big lie. There was no advising. It was all dictating from above. Well, the Ukraine was one of them. And it was not only the grain belt, the food basket for a good part of Europe, not just Russia, but also the Bible Belt of Europe. So in 1931, in order to finance the industrialization of the Soviet Union, because it really was an agrarian society, an agricultural society, forced collectivization of farmland was begun. In other words, individual owners of land were saying, no, we're going to take ownership of the land, but you can still say and work it, but you're working for the state now, not for yourself. All right, so peasants resisted, production decreased, food was hoarded, and a man-made famine in one of the most productive agricultural regions of the world began. By 1932, the unrest and anti-Soviet feeling in the Ukraine had risen to the point that the Soviet leadership felt they were at risk of losing the Ukraine. So Stalin, here with his decreed that the land would all be taken, the food would all be confiscated, the food was sold to the West. So they could buy the industrial machinery to industrialize the Soviet Union. And the Ukraine was starved into submission. So this was a man-made disaster called the Holodomor in Ukrainian. And so there were children, and not just children, but adults as well, literally starving to death. No food. So the Ukraine was starved into submission, and peasants were either deported to Siberia so they could grow and farm there, or starved to death, or those who actively resisted were shot. So estimates range from 7 to 10 million Ukrainians were deliberately killed in the winter of 32-33. When I was in the Ukraine, one of the occasions there, I went to the Holodomor Museum, a very sobering place. So here you see a graph showing how grain production crashed after that winter of 32. And, you know, that's what happens. Also, it's uncountable how many millions of livestock were killed as well, along with that. All right, so you can see the value put on human life in the workers' paradise, as they called it themselves. Another aspect of this was here you see a German SS officer saluting Russian NKVD officers, then KGB, and today it's FSB. It's all the same thing, just different names. The state secret police. Because they're turning over Jews who made the mistake of fleeing eastward out of Germany instead of going westward or across the ocean. So there was a documentary made after the fall of the communist regime at the end of 1991. And those are the official stamps in wax, the seals of the SS and the Soviet Union. And interestingly, when this was made public, Putin's response to this was, oh, the worst thing that ever happened, the biggest tragedy in history was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was his response. Okay, evolution of foundation in America. Conservative capitulation, compromise on an old earth. Can any man tell me when the beginning was? Years ago, we thought the beginning of this world was when Adam came upon it, but we have discovered that thousands of years before that, God was preparing chaotic matter to make it a fit abode for man, putting races of creatures upon it who might die and leave behind marks of his handiwork and marvelous skill before he tried his hand on man. Extremely influential theologian in the U.S. in the 1800s, Charles Spurgeon. Okay? So, and I'm giving you, this is the abridged version of this talk. I'm only giving you one example in each category. There are many others. So I'm not picking on just one guy. Just for time, we can't talk about more of them. But Schofield I'll mention. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. So this is the good, straightforward scripture. But Schofield wrote, Jeremiah, etc., Isaiah, etc., clearly indicate that the earth had undergone a cataclysmic change as the result of divine judgment. The face of the earth bears everywhere the marks of such a catastrophe. There are not wanting imitations which connect it with the previous testing and fall of angels. So what he's talking about, this business of some previous catastrophe, then this big time gap, this business of the gap theory, and then things are started over again. So unfortunately, here again is tremendous compromise undermining the historicity of Scripture. So when you see these kinds of footnotes in Job chapter 40, trying to call behemoth, well, an elephant or a hippopotamus, you know, those are not inspired by the Holy Spirit. They're inspired by compromised thinking on a human's part. And then you may be aware of the Scopes trial, 1925. So this is from a movie called Inherit the Wind, in which just about everything in that movie is exactly opposite of what really happened in true life. And so the character on the left is playing Clarence Darrow, the lawyer from the ACLU, which had just been formed in 1920. And then Frederick March here is playing the part of William Jennings Bryan, who, very intelligent man, claimed to be a Bible-believing Christian. He was the Democrat Party nominee for president in the 1890s, at least twice. Ended up serving as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson, and he was a phenomenal orator. So in 1925, he volunteered to work with the lawyers, the local lawyers in Tennessee, in Dayton, Tennessee, on the part of the prosecution. And so he was asked by Clarence Darrow the question of when was creation? How long ago was it? What were the length of creation days? Where did Cain get his wife? Because Clarence Darrow had tricked William Jennings Bryan into agreeing to be on the witness stand. That both of them would be on the witness stand and questioned by the other. Now, can you imagine it happening in a courtroom today, when the lawyers participating on each side are going to be on the witness stand? There are a lot of things that were really not quite kosher. Well, William Jennings' response to all these questions was, I don't know, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Well, that doesn't inspire a lot of confidence in Scripture. You know, it's a very big setback for people having confidence in Scripture. Well, Margaret Sanger, Planned Parenthood. That was not its original title. The name got changed during World War II. So here are some quotes of her. The most merciful thing that a family does to one of its infant members is to kill it. Okay? She's a real sweetheart. Birth control must lead ultimately to a cleaner race. Ah, there we go. We have racism here. Cleaner race. What does she mean by that? We should hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful educational approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal. We don't want the word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. Whoa. John Dewey. Not the Dewey who was the other candidate for presidency in 1948 against Truman. This is John Dewey. He was an extremely active speaker, writer, and got himself appointed to the faculty at Columbia University in New York. Ardent humanist, anti-creationist, atheist. Meaning is wider in scope as well as more precious in value than is truth. Okay, if that doesn't make sense to you, join the club. And philosophy is occupied with meaning rather than with truth. Isn't this amazing? Now, what's truly sad is this guy set in the motion the takeover of the American public educational system by people thinking this way. So he indoctrinated his students with that way of thinking, and subsequent generations of their students, and on until by 1960s, our educational system was taken over by this way of thinking. Shades of Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. So the consequence of this stuff. Eugenics certificate. So now you could get a certificate from a physician to say you had good genes, except they had no clue how to measure, sequence genes. It was just an opinion on the part of the physician on the appearance of the person. Okay, so look at the date, 1913, eugenic sterilization legislation. All right, so various stages of legislation being introduced, but look at the date. This was done, and Hitler looked at this and said, this is great, this is what I'm going to do. See, we gave him the impetus in our own country here. Well, probably the most infamous case involved is Carrie Buck. Carrie is the daughter, the younger one, and she was conceived out of wedlock and was in school, did very well in school until she was taken out of school and made to be like a housemaid in a family's home, well-off family. And then at one point, their nephew visited and raped her, and then she had a baby out of wedlock. And so she was picked out of several, quite a few people, to be the case, the study case, to try and get legislation able to be done on a national level instead of going through each state to say that forced sterilization was okay, was legal in the entire country. And again, this is the ACLU and other people as part of this. And so there is Carrie's baby there. And so we see here that there were quite a few states involved with legal sterilization. And the numbers were, if I remember right, between 20 and 30,000 people in the US in which this was done. And this is, again, prior to Hitler taking over. So he said, oh, what a great example the Americans have set. Okay, another situation, Ota Benga was taken from a native territory in Africa and was put on display in the St. Louis World's Fair in 1906, along with this chimp here as an evolutionary exhibit. And then after the World's Fair was over, he was then put into the New York Zoo in a cage with an orangutan and labeled him as the missing link. Okay, whoops, too many. Let's try that again. Well, indeed, discrimination was a very terrible thing. There were different drinking fountains for whites and blacks. Blacks had to sit in the back of the bus, or if there was a movie theater in the balcony, they had to sit up in the balcony, couldn't sit on the main floor. So there was tremendous discrimination, even after slavery had been made illegal. But one of the worst things was this business in Tuskegee, Alabama, where for many decades, from 1932 to 1972, adult men, blacks, who had syphilis were not treated with penicillin, even after it became widely available, even into the 70s, to observe the effects of the syphilis. And of course, it's a terribly disabling progressive disease. And this was just unreal. And so finally, by 1972, there was such an outcry from the rest of the medical community, this experiment was finally halted. Abortion. All right, you already saw these. Well, these were used when the Supreme Court said abortion is legal. These false drawings, they were already known to be false from photographs, but they were still used, just like they were still put in textbooks. So these are the numbers of surgical abortions in the US, and it only goes up to 2000 and looks like 2 or 3. So up to that point, and even I extended the graph up to 2017, 63,459,781 documented surgical abortions in this nation. So when we talk about Nazi Germany, we're kind of looking in the mirror here of ourselves. Now, I just wanted to say this, if anybody in the audience or anybody listening and subsequent broadcasts of this ever been involved in an abortion situation, just remember God's grace is sufficient in that setting as for every other setting. So turn to Him. So there's the number. And now the number of facilities that carry out these abortions is decreasing because more and more states are saying, okay, enough. But this does not take into account the chemical abortions that are being done. So somewhere over 610 million chemical abortions from 65 to 2009. And I couldn't find really good statistics since then that were reliable. Well, let's look at the situation a year after Roe was overturned. So here you see the deeper the red, the more restrictive. Orange, very restrictive, yellow, restrictive. And as it gets more to blue, the most protective of abortion. So that's 2023, and as of May 23rd, so 2 months ago, you can see now it's now been made legal beyond 22 weeks in the states that are blue. Okay. You can see there's somewhat of a correlation between red and blue in a political sphere, maybe. Euthanasia. I remember this clearly because I was in my last year of medical school when this happened. Karen Ann Quinlan was a college student who was partying, had too much to drink, used some drugs, and she ended up throwing up and then aspirating some of that vomitus into her lungs. So she was not able to get enough oxygen into her brain and went into a coma. Well, she was kept alive and respirator and IV fluids and things, and parents said, please turn it off, and it was not legal. So the court case was taken to the New Jersey Supreme Court, and then this die with dignity decision was made, and that's the very same phrase the Germans used, die with dignity. I should say the Nazis used. She lived until 1985. 1985. Wow. 9 years later. Also on the euthanasia front, this is Dr. Jack Kevorkian. He was an MD, but he was a pathologist. He didn't take care of living people. He dealt with the dead. All right? And he set up patients, gave them IVs into them, and gave them the drugs that they could push into the IV themselves to kill themselves. Well, this was highly illegal. And he was tried, but not convicted. The juries ended up hung juries, and so mistrials were declared. In a fourth trial, he finally received a sentence of 10 to 25 years. So he did go to prison, and then finally was released later on. So Dr. Death. Well, we don't have the authority to decide when we're going to die. In Hebrews chapter 9, and as it is appointed for men to die once, but after this, the judgment. So here was a cartoon at the time. Welcome to Oregon Hospital. Dr. Reaper will be assisting me. Oregon was the first state to legalize euthanasia. And then here you see the same blue business, the same geography, subsequently made euthanasia legal. Now it's not as extensive as the territory in which abortion at later ages, after 22 weeks of development, has been made legal, but still, it's too much. Dollars for death. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, the brother of Rahm Emanuel, President Obama's chief of staff, was a special advisor on healthcare policy. And his attitude was summed up in this article, titled, "What are the potential cost savings from legalizing physician-assisted suicide?" See, it was about the money. So this graph shows, I love this complete life system. It's Orwellian, you know, it's backwards. So if you're too young to be a productive worker or too old to be a productive worker, then your chances of getting good health care are less than if you're in the productive working age group. That's what that graph is showing. And it's going to add a little time, but I think this is important. When I was in training, when I was a resident, I walked in the hospital Monday morning, and the hospital operator said, "They need you in the ICU to go translate." So I went up there, and there was a Soviet citizen who had been in the US visiting his family in Arizona, and his family had already left the airport, and as he was getting ready to get on the plane, he had a sudden severe episode of chest pain. So he was brought to the hospital next to the airport where I was on staff. So I went up there and started talking to him in Russian, and after a few minutes I was able to turn to the guys actually taking care of him and said, "This guy's got a blood clot in the lung, he's got a pulmonary embolus." Well, so the guy was scared out of his gourd. We treated him, we gave him the appropriate therapy, and 3 days later, he finally opened up and started talking, and he told me that he had had a similar but not as severe episode earlier back in the Soviet Union, but after he had retired, was no longer working, went to a local healthcare facility, and they said, "Oh, go away, old man, we're not going to waste resources on you." The second thing he told me was, they told him, "Don't get sick in America because the docs will kill you on purpose." The third thing they told him was, "Don't be late in getting back here or things will happen to your family in the Soviet Union." So we treated him, watched him in the clinic, outpatient, after he was discharged for 6 weeks, make sure he was stable. Then I said to the guys taking care of him, I said, they're not going to give him any medicine whatsoever. He still needed to be on medicine to keep him from forming clots. So I said, give him a 6-month supply, and I wrote letters in Russian to the docs back there, and I don't know whatever happened to him, but that's the worker's paradise for you. So I call this healthcare rationing. I think that's the more appropriate title. Encouraging the voluntary suicide of the elderly is the last stop before mandatory euthanasia. And that's the direction these folks are headed. But it's always them deciding it's for everybody else but them. Like all of this stuff, what these people are coming out with today, it's not for me, but Dr. Donald Berwick, the progressive policy regime will control and rationalize financing control. One over-demanded service is prevention, annual physicals, screening tests, and other measures that supposedly help catch diseases early. Okay, supposedly, all right? This is so untrue, it's unreal. Young doctors and nurses should emerge from training understanding the values of standardization and the risks of too great an emphasis on individual autonomy. So what this is saying in plain English is, don't think for yourself, use cookie-cutter medicine. In the educational field, we have indoctrination, as I mentioned, with this stuff like these inaccurate drawings, teaching human evolution from apes, Neanderthals, cavemen, as being some kind of intermediate, but they're not. They were fully human and smarter than us, by the way. Okay, teaching about vestigial organs, among them the appendix, the tree of life, which you still see the diagrams in every biology textbook. But the true story here is it's the creation orchard or forest with these various created kinds, with branches representing speciation in each kind, but no change from kind to kind. All right. I'm a graduate of the University of Arizona, so when I have the opportunity to diss Arizona State, I take it. So Arizona State has been, he's no longer on faculty, he was removed for other reasons. Lawrence Krauss, a physicist who had this great talent to write the word nothing backwards on this clear panel so it faced the audience. And so a universe from nothing. So he wrote this book claiming that he had figured out how a universe from nothing came into existence without God. Well, other physicists read it and said, this is garbage. National Center for Science Education, what it really is an indoctrination center. Eugenie Scott has now stepped down as leading it, but she led it for many years. And its whole purpose is to keep creation teaching out of our schools and to indoctrinate our students in evolution. The level of education is declining. You who worry about Democrats versus Republicans, relax. Here's our real problem. In a Purdue University classroom, they were discussing the qualifications to be president of the United States. Pretty simple. Candidate must be a natural-born citizen of at least 35 years of age. However, one girl in the class immediately started in on how unfair was the requirement to be a natural-born citizen. In short, her opinion was that this requirement prevented many capable individuals from becoming president. The class was taking it in and letting her rant, and not many jaws hit the floor when she wrapped up her argument by saying, "What makes a natural-born citizen any more qualified to lead this country than one born by C-section?" Indoctrination, not education. How many of you saw the movie Expelled? A great number of you. Fantastic. The rest of you, make sure you see it. Ben Stein, very intelligent man, a Jewish fellow, not aware that he is a Christian, made this marvelous movie showing how in the university setting, anybody who believes in creation is expelled, or more likely not even hired in the first place. So, very interesting. In my 14 times in Eastern Europe and Russia, teaching all over those Eastern European countries, the locals got me into the state universities, state medical schools, and state higher institutions, as well as churches and seminaries, and I could freely teach creation science there in the public state schools. I can't do it here. Fortunately, I'm blessed to be able to teach at Arizona Christian University, and I've got full freedom. And the university has a public statement, this is where we stand. So, it's more like Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany. An example, The Privileged Planet, a fantastic book talking about many of the different factors that show why this planet. He doesn't use biblical language, he doesn't say God, he just simply points out all these factors that have to be the way they are for life to be on the planet and for us to be able to observe the universe. And he got canned. The media. So here was a big push discovering Ardipithecus. What Darwin never knew, well, of course he never knew it because it never happened. Okay, Time Magazine, all these things pushing evolution, Discovery Channel, wildlife specials, books, how humans evolved. Now this one really gets me. National Geographic, Dictatorship. Is it really bad? Is it really a bad thing? Okay? Time, is God dead? Billboards put up by atheists. Praise Darwin. Evolve beyond belief. Yes, Virginia, there is no God. Club of Rome think tank. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fill the bill. All these dangers are caused by human intervention. It's only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy is humanity itself. Okay, my time is short, so here is a comparison. This is where we stand in comparison with those. Okay, doesn't look good. Okay, join us in celebrating Darwin Day. Well, National Association of Biology Teachers, you expect that. In the church, we have churches who support and promulgate Darwin Day. Well, I'm not sure. I guess it's been washed. Okay. I'll stop there. But the bottom line is, a society which is based on evolution is doomed to dictatorship. Whoever has the biggest gun is going to call the shots, and everyone else will be forced to comply. There's a move now to have a digital dollar. Now, I'm not talking about electronic banking, a digital dollar. The government will control it, and we will be found to be unworthy of the ability to buy, sell, or trade. I'll stop there.
Boy, wasn't that great? Thank you so much for doing that, Dr. Kezele. Yeah, can you guys hear me in the back? Is this on? Okay, we're good. All right, thank you for all that work and for sharing that, and I thank you for hitting some of those controversial topics. And I'd like to thank everybody here who made this possible. Thank you for the donations. We're going to pass the hat. And if anybody's watching online, you can go into our Give, Send, Go account and make a donation there. It's at TCCSA. And also, if you have an IRA and you don't like paying any more taxes than you have to, you can get it out of your IRA and get it to us, and then you won't be charged, it won't be taxed as income. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for the people who helped promote this and invite people. And with the websites and the flyers and also the tech people behind the scenes. Next month's talk is Kevin Lee. He's coming in and he stood face to face with a NASA scientist and said, we're going to find stuff from the Earth in that comet. And the NASA scientist, Dr. Brownlee, says, no, we're going to find stuff in the Oort cloud. And Kevin Lee was right. They found a whole bunch of stuff from Earth. And then he emailed the same guy about 6 years ago and said, if you try to redirect an asteroid, it'll work if it's a solid rock. But if it's a bunch of boulders, which is what the hydroplate theory would predict, then it's going to fail because you're going to get a lot of boulders coming at us. And guess what? They failed. There's a lot of boulders coming at us. So he's going to be talking next month. It's going to be Zoom, but I encourage you to come anyway. And also, I'm going to see him in a few weeks in Houston because there is a hydroplate, catastrophic plate, a round table down there. He's flying in for it. I'm flying in for it. I gave the talk last month. Somebody flew me down there to give it. And so it's a controversial topic, and I think it needs to be discussed. We need to see both sides. And so I encourage everybody, and thank everybody for being here. If you can pray about sending waivers. And then, Steve, come on up here. Steve, he's from the International Association for Creation. And what he does is he helps people, he teaches them how to give tours at secular museums. And we had 40 of them at Como Zoo today. So if you would just tell them a little bit about why it would be helpful.
Hi guys, thank you for having me today. So here at Christian Museum Tours, we're giving Christian tours of secular museums from a biblical worldview, teaching about creation science and how we can see God's creation in light of what we're shown in the everyday world. So we're in several cities. We're looking to expand in Minneapolis. Clearly there is a large demand. We have 1 day's notice of this tour and we have 40 people show up. If you're interested in getting paid to give creation tours at places like the Como Zoo or the Bell Museum, it would be great to talk to you. I'll be here after the meeting and I can give you my contact information, answer any questions you might have. We do a 3-week online training. We give you the talking points. You set your own schedule and you set your own rate to pay yourself. So it's a pretty entrepreneurial opportunity, and it's great for any of you out there who have a passion for telling people about God and evangelism.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And he said that Como Zoo is one of the best zoos in the country. He just loved it. And so we're going to turn it over for Q&A. We're going to go till 8:30, and so thank you again for coming.
Questions, folks?
I want to make them loud and clear.
You're stunned. Okay.
So I have a particular interest in this topic because I'm Italian. My family was subject to Hitler's reign. And so have you done any research on like Mussolini's involvement and how he was influenced by evolution?
Okay, who is this now?
Mussolini?
How Mussolini was affected by evolutionary teaching.
Yeah, the same way that Hitler might have been.
I haven't looked at that, but being a dictator, I would say he probably was very much so. Yeah. Interesting question. Yeah, everyone talks about Hitler. That would be a great thing to look into. Yes, sir.
I appreciate what you said about Margaret Sanger. The only thing that I've heard, because I haven't read any biographies of her, but I do know that she wanted to depopulate. She came from a large family, and she thought her mom was overburdened, therefore we have to have less people. So it applied to her first in her personal context, then she just took it out on the road in the US, in Germany, and she also wanted to bring her thoughts about reducing population or selective reduction into China. I didn't know she went that far. But she realized, or China said, that China just didn't welcome her. They thought it was a bunch of bunk. You're not going to catch on over here. I don't know who was in charge during that time, or who she met with, or communicated with in China, but they didn't embrace it at all. It stayed in Europe.
What year was that?
Well, I don't know the year, to be honest. When she died, 1940. I don't know how. She tried there, but nothing stuck. My ideas are not sticking in China. I'm going to stick to Western Europe, to Germany and Russia and so forth.
Could y'all hear that back there? No. Okay, so my guess is it was before the communists took power.
Yeah, you're probably right. So I just can't.
Because they certainly adopted the one child per family rule later on, and it led to
that was long after.
Long after, and it led to social disaster, because now there are all these, in Chinese culture, the son was responsible for the parents in old age.
Yeah, they embraced
and
it.
So
the Chinese Communist Party embraced it, not the people.
Right, but there ended up being abortions of tremendous number of female pregnancies, and so there's a whole generation of guys, not enough women to marry. It's a disaster.
That's right.
Yes.
When you went to medical school, were they teaching you about how to give medical assisted suicide or any of those type of things?
Okay.
Were they teaching medical assisted suicide when you were in college?
No. Matter of fact, in medical school, there was only one mention of evolution in my human embryology course, and there was nothing about assisted suicide, but abortions were being done. I actually witnessed one when I was a medical student, but not about suicide being assisted. Yes, sir.
Two questions. First question is, are the medical establishment today using age as a rationale for level of care? And then the second question is, what do you see coming in the future as far as how will the agenda look as they roll it out?
Okay, that was about age rationing care.
Yes.
Okay, if you weren't a productive worker, then you would be less likely to get care. Okay, just like that example I gave you from the Soviet Union. But that's was being promulgated by folks in the Obama administration.
Is that happening now?
I don't think so, at least not largely. There may be some, maybe, how do you say this, subtle decisions being made, but I'm not aware of it. But the thing is, whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And for Medicare, it's the government paying, and so at some point they could very well start rationing care. Yes, sir.
I have two questions too. The first one was that, and I don't know if you've heard this before, but Margaret Sanger, I think it was the American Family Association, said one of the reasons she wanted to do eugenics was to combat Christianity.
To combat which?
Christianity.
To combat Christianity.
I don't know about that. I can't comment.
Do you know of any Christian pastors who didn't succumb to the idea of evolution?
Okay, are you talking about theistic evolution where God uses it, or are you talking about godless evolution?
I'm talking about young earth creationism. Any pastors that stood for young earth creationism?
Oh yeah, certainly there were some, and but they were overwhelmed by those who compromised. Like, look at the state of the church in general today. It is quite weak. It is hardly indistinguishable from the society at large because of compromise. It's a sad situation. So, yes, sir.
Well, Margaret Sanger was for selective breeding and for depopulation before the pill came out. And when the pill came out, obviously she was for that because she wanted depopulation. She wanted to limit the number of pregnancies. So she was on the pharmaceutical side. The pharmaceuticals that industry hijacked our way of teaching medicine in the West. They hijacked it, and they have got a strong grip on the way medicine is taught and practiced in this country. So the pharmaceuticals are a major player when it comes to ideological reasons to buy their products.
I've got a slide that I didn't show you guys. And you notice, there it is, third from the bottom.
Yep.
Right, but these other guys, are all of these are in unison. Now, they have different goals, but they all are synergistic in what they're doing. And it's, in the longer version of this talk, I go into more detail on each one of these. But then we would be here a lot longer. Okay, next question. Yes, sir.
I may not have been listening carefully, but you said you taught, where were you teaching where you felt freer to teach creation science than you did when you came to this country?
Okay.
Where did you feel freer to teach creation than when in here?
Here.
You felt,
Where do I feel freer? Here in the U.S.? What places?
where
No.
did you feel freer, here or in Russia,
Okay, the answer is
with creation?
there and in churches here that will let me in the door, and with fellow creation groups that exist. So we're in little pockets here in this country. And it shouldn't be that way. It should be the other way around. So in terms of, well, like I said before, in terms of Russia, I was in the state universities, the state medical schools, the state higher educational institutions, as well as churches and seminaries.
That's good to know. It's surprising.
And not just Russia, but Eastern Europe in general. Why? They had already lived through communism, and they had experienced the dictatorship, and they knew the hard way.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
I come from a small country in South America. It's called Guyana. It was ruled by a dictator. I left there in 1975. And when I first came to America, we had 3 children. We have 8 now. My biggest problem was the indoctrination.
With what?
When I first came to this country in 1979, indoctrination was my problem.
Okay.
Indoctrination.
We were taught principles of discipline and everyday English language. I come from an English-speaking country. The first time I went to the school in New York City with my kids, I had a problem. The very first time. I moved from New York City to Minnesota. And we tried private school, Catholic school, private school, Christian school, whatever school, same thing. Even the Christian school in this state is indoctrinating children.
Okay, so that's not a question. Okay.
So my question, this whole list of people that we have here, this whole long list, are the people who are promoting this indoctrination. How can we stop this?
How can we stop this indoctrination that's being promoted by all these people?
We have to get to the truth. In other words, we have to get the truth to the general population. It all goes back to belief in Christ. That's the crucial point. That's the bottom line. And so this kind of talk is simply a tool to try and help lead people to the Lord. When they have that truth, this will take care of itself. That's the issue. Okay, just I want to very quickly say a little commercial here. Kezele has produced 6 different DVDs. I won't name them. Just if you buy one, list price $13. If you buy 2, 2 for $20. That's $10 each instead of 13. Any subsequent after 2, only $5 each. Okay, clear them out. We also have some books written by a lady in Prescott, Arizona, biblical historical fiction based on those first 11 chapters of Genesis, including a good amount of science, but in a very readable form and with the historical, biblical figures and fictional figures woven together. Extremely entertaining. I edited all 3 books. They are fantastic.